If you are killed, die with honor. If you are surrounded, disappear into the forest. But never, under any circumstance, surrender. The voice was sharp, steady, echoing off the wooden walls of the briefing hut. Outside, rain hammered the tin roof. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, 22 years old and newly assigned to the Imperial Army's Intelligence Corps, stood at attention as the words drilled into him. He didn't blink. The date was December 1944. Japan was already losing the war, though few dared to admit it. Onoda's orders were simple, at least on paper: travel to the Philippine island of Lubang, join the local garrison, and wage guerrilla warfare against the approaching American forces. Sabotage their airfields, destroy supplies, gather intelligence, but never surrender. He would command a small unit and operate until further notice. That phrase, until further notice, would become his prison. The flight to Lubang was short. The island below looked peaceful, lush, green, surrounded by turquoise reefs, but Onoda knew better. The Americans were coming, and soon. When he landed, Japanese troops were already demoralized and scattered. The officer in charge, older and weary, told him quietly, "We won't hold for long. The orders from Manila are confused. The Navy has pulled back. We're on our own." That night, Onoda inspected his men, 3 privates, thin and serious, and a corporal named Kinshichi Kozuka, who carried himself like someone born for obedience. "We will survive," Onoda said simply. "And we will fight. Even if the rest of Japan falls into the sea." The jungle closed around them. The air smelled of rot and rain. Insects screamed from the trees. They built shelters from bamboo, stored rice, and buried crates of ammunition beneath layers of wet soil. Every sound in the dark might be an American patrol. Every shadow might be death. In his small notebook, Onoda wrote, "The forest is eternal. We must learn to be the same." By February 1945, the Americans had landed. The defense of Lubang lasted less than a week. The remaining Japanese soldiers were killed, captured, or fled into the hills. Onoda and his men retreated deep into the interior, moving at night, leaving no tracks. When they heard gunfire in the distance, they believed it was the Empire fighting on. The war was collapsing, but Onoda didn't know that. His only link to command was a shortwave radio, half-broken, that caught faint bursts of static. "Tokyo," one of the soldiers whispered hopefully, adjusting the dial. Nothing but silence answered. Then came August 1945. The sky over Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned. Japan surrendered. The emperor spoke over the radio, the first time his voice had ever been heard by the people. But Onoda and his men were hidden beneath the trees, listening to rain. They never heard the broadcast. Weeks later, American planes began dropping leaflets over Lubang. The messages were simple: the war is over. Lay down your arms. Japan has surrendered. The leaflets showed the emperor's photograph and his personal seal. Kozuka picked one up from a clearing and brought it to Onoda. "Sir, what if it's true?" Onoda studied the paper for a long time. The edges were damp. The ink smeared under his thumb. "It's a trick," he said finally. "They want us to expose ourselves. The Americans are cunning. We will not fall for it." So the leaflets burned in their campfire, curling into ash. Days turned into months. The Americans withdrew, leaving the island to civilians and a few Filipino police patrols. For the rest of the world, the war was over. But in the dense jungles of Lubang, Onoda's men believed it had merely changed shape. They built new shelters, repaired their rifles, and set traps for enemy collaborators. One night, a soldier whispered, "Do you think Tokyo still stands?" Onoda didn't answer. He stared into the fire and imagined a Japan still fighting, still waiting for him. He had been told that an imperial soldier never surrenders, that obedience was the highest form of life. If Japan truly had fallen, then the only way to keep it alive was inside himself. Months later, a message arrived by megaphone. Filipino villagers shouted in Japanese, "The war is finished. Go home." The men listened in silence. Onoda shook his head. "If it were real, the Imperial Army would send my commander." He repeated that to himself every night, "They will send my commander." The rain never stopped. The forest grew thicker. The years began to blur. Somewhere, across the ocean, peace had returned. Cities were rebuilt. Radios played jazz, cars filled the streets, children laughed again. But on one forgotten island, for soldiers still polished their rifles by candlelight, waiting for an order that would never come. And as the monsoon thunder rolled through the mountains, Onoda whispered into the dark, "The Emperor still needs us." Outside, the jungle breathed, endless, patient, indifferent. The world was moving on. But for him, it had already stopped. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. "We found the leaflets lying in the mud," Onoda recalled years later, his voice flat, almost detached. "They said the war was over. We laughed. The first ones fluttered down in early September 1945, dropped from American planes circling above the island. Thin paper, printed in Japanese, bearing the imperial seal. The emperor's face looked out from the page, distant and soft. "Japan has surrendered," the words read. "Hostilities have ceased. Return home safely." But to Onoda, it was absurd. "The enemy knows our psychology," he told his men. "They think we'll believe this and surrender. That's how they trap fools. We're not fools." They buried the leaflets, then dug them up again weeks later when more arrived. The second batch carried news of cities destroyed, the words Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To Onoda, it sounded like another lie, propaganda meant to break their will. "Impossible," he muttered. "Japan can't fall." By then, they had moved deeper into the interior of Lubang Island, away from villages and patrols. The jungle there was thick as a wall, every path swallowed by vines. The air hung heavy with damp earth and decay. Their uniforms rotted on their bodies. They patched them with bark and scraps of parachute silk. They learned to eat what the island offered, wild bananas, frogs, even snakes when the rains drove the game away. "War teaches you what hunger really means," one of the soldiers wrote in his notebook before it molded to dust. "It's when you start to dream about rice." For a while, they still believed the main Japanese force would return. Every ship on the horizon looked like salvation. But the months stretched into years, and the ships never came. In 1946, Filipino villagers discovered the remains of a small Japanese encampment. There were empty ration tins, rusted bayonets, a flag half buried in dirt. The newspapers called it the last ghost of the war. They were wrong. Onoda and his men were still alive, hiding in the mountains. They divided tasks, Kozuka and Shimada hunted, Akatsu cooked and kept watch. Onoda planned raids. They watched from the tree-line as locals worked in rice fields, then slipped out at night to steal food. Once, they found a cow tied to a post. "The Americans feed their spies well," Kozuka joked. They slaughtered it and vanished before dawn. Weeks later, they heard shouting in the village below, police searching the forest, angry voices in Tagalog. The war, it seemed, had returned to Lubang. "Every sound became an alarm," Onoda wrote later. "The jungle no longer hid us. It tested us." The men started to argue. Akatsu, the youngest, doubted their mission. "Maybe the war did end," he whispered once. "Maybe we're the only ones left." Onoda's stare was cold. "You question the emperor?" Akatsu said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. A few months later, he slipped away one night, leaving his rifle behind. They found his footprints in the mud leading toward the coast. "Traitor," Onoda said, though his voice trembled slightly. "He'll talk. We must move." For weeks they relocated through the mountains, certain that Filipino police were closing in. When no one came, they decided Akatsu must have died in the forest. Only years later would Onoda learn the truth. Akatsu had survived, surrendered to local authorities, and eventually returned to Japan. The newspapers back home called him the soldier who gave up. Onoda never forgave him. By 1947, the islanders knew the names of the ghosts who haunted their crops. The Japanese bandits, they called them. Rumors spread of ambushes, of farmers shot while tending rice, of stores burned. Onoda's small unit was blamed for dozens of attacks. Each time someone died, he justified it as war. If they aid the Americans, he told himself, they are enemies. Still, even conviction began to crack under the weight of silence. Sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, Kozuka would listen to the distant hum of aircraft and say quietly, if the war truly ended, wouldn't someone come for us? They will, Onoda replied, though he wasn't sure anymore. The forest had become a world of its own, no clocks, no calendars, only endless rain and the pulse of survival. When the moon was full, they whispered prayers to the emperor, as if the sky above Lubang still connected to Tokyo. In 1950, 5 years after Japan's surrender, a new batch of leaflets appeared, printed more carefully this time, even signed by government officials. Onoda examined them by firelight. The paper was too clean, too new. It's American printing, he decided. Look at the typeface. He burned them all. That same year, rumors reached him of a man captured near the southern beach, a Japanese soldier who had surrendered voluntarily. The name was Akatsu. Onoda read the note carved into a tree by villagers, he is alive and safe. Alive, and speaking to the enemy. That night, Onoda sat awake, polishing his rifle. He whispered to Kozuka, if they catch me, I'll shoot myself before I let them use me. Kozuka nodded solemnly. As will I. Outside, rain fell steady and cold. The jungle dripped with the same rhythm as 5 years before, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The world had moved on to peace and prosperity. The empire was gone. Yet on one small island, 24 miles long, 4 men still lived by an order that no one remembered to cancel. And as dawn broke through the trees, Onoda cleaned his bayonet, looked toward the sea, and whispered, one day, the commander will return. He believed it completely. 1959, the radio in Tokyo announced, man reaches for the stars. But on a forgotten island in the Philippines, time had stopped. For 14 years, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda had lived in the jungle of Lubang, convinced the war had never ended. His uniform was a patchwork of faded cloth and vines. His boots were held together with wire. The barrel of his Arisaka rifle still shone, polished every night with oil made from coconuts. The forest had swallowed everything. Paths vanished under vines, villages blurred into fog. The outside world, its peace, its progress, was nothing but rumor. For Onoda and his comrade, Corporal Kinshichi Kozuka, there was only the mission, never surrender, never believe the enemy. Every few months, new leaflets fell from the sky. Japan has surrendered, they read. Return home safely. Some were signed with names of government ministers, others carried photographs of families. Onoda studied the typeface, the paper, the ink. American forgery, he decided. They think we're fools. He burned them all. The locals called them ghosts. At night, rice disappeared from granaries, tools from sheds, animals from fields. Police searched the mountains, but never found them. When gunfire echoed in the distance, villagers crossed themselves and said, the war spirits are angry again. Inside the forest, the 2 men kept their own calendar, measured not by years, but by moonlight. Every night, Onoda wrote reports in a damp notebook. March 12. Engaged 3 locals near stream. Escaped without casualties. November 8. Observed American aircraft overhead. Still active. Awaiting orders. Always those same words, awaiting orders. The isolation began to change them. Kozuka's laughter faded first. Then his faith. If Japan truly won, he said one night, why haven't they sent anyone for us? They will, Onoda replied sharply. The emperor does not forget his soldiers. But deep down, even he had begun to wonder. In 1959, a new search party arrived from Japan. They carried loudspeakers, calling into the jungle in his own language, Lieutenant Onoda. The war is over. Japan has rebuilt. Their voices trembled with sincerity. Onoda listened from the shadows, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe them. But the uniforms looked foreign, the accent strange. Actors, he whispered. They're using Japanese collaborators. He and Kozuka moved camp again, farther inland. From that day, they never lit another fire. Smoke meant death. Years blurred together. They learned to hunt silently, to sleep under rain. Kozuka began talking to the trees, asking them if Tokyo still existed. Onoda pretended not to hear. In 1965, another team arrived, this time with magazines, newspapers, even a letter from his family. One article showed the Tokyo Olympics, crowds cheering, flags waving, the rising sun flying proudly. Kozuka held the paper like a relic. Sir, he whispered, it looks real. Onoda stared at the photo. His throat tightened. For a heartbeat, he felt the warmth of home, the smell of tatami mats, the sound of his mother's voice. Then he folded the paper and said, if it were real, they would send my commander. Until then, we stay. They burned the papers that night. The ashes drifted into the rain. By 1970, the war had lived inside Onoda longer than his youth had. Kozuka's hair was gray now, both men moved slowly, their bones stiff with age. Still, they carried rifles, still spoke in military code. Then came October 1972. Farmers were burning fields near the coast when gunfire cracked through the air. Kozuka, investigating the smoke, was shot and killed. Onoda reached him minutes later. The body lay face up, eyes open to the sky. For the first time in decades, Onoda knelt and wept. You did your duty, he whispered. I'll finish mine. He buried Kozuka beneath a palm tree, marked the spot with stones, and walked back into the forest alone. News of the killing spread fast. A Japanese soldier still fighting World War II, the headlines read. He never surrendered. Search teams returned, carrying photographs, letters, even recordings of his brother's voice. Hidden among the trees, Onoda listened. The voice trembled with age. Hiroo, come home, it said in Japanese. The war ended long ago. He froze. For a moment, he believed it. Then he saw Filipino soldiers nearby, watching the speakers. A trick, he told himself. They've learned to mimic our voices now. He packed his rifle and vanished deeper into the hills. The forest closed around him again, wet, endless, timeless. And as men walked on the moon, as Japan rose from ruins into light, one soldier still stood guard on an island that time had forgotten, waiting for an order that no one would ever give. We were two, Onoda would later whisper, his voice thin as paper. And then there was only one. When Kozuka fell, I knew, the emperor now spoke only to me. It was October 1972 when the police found Kozuka's body on Lubang Island. The official report said he'd been killed in an exchange of fire with local patrolmen while burning rice fields in the belief that the war continued. The words were written neatly in English and Tagalog, but to Onoda, they were just another lie. The enemy, he muttered from the tree lean, watching the smoke rise from the coast, has learned to forge even death. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and vanished deeper into the jungle. The world far beyond those trees erupted with headlines. Tokyo newspapers splashed the story across their front pages, is Lieutenant Onoda still alive? For the first time in decades, Japan remembered the war it had tried to forget. Television programs showed faded photographs of a young officer with sharp eyes and a confident smile. Children who had never known war stared at the screen, asking their parents, why is he still fighting? But Onoda didn't see any of it. In his world, nothing had changed. The forest had aged with him. Trees he'd known as saplings were now towering sentinels. The vines grew thicker, the trails harder to walk. He was 50 years old now, but he still rose at dawn, patrolled in formation, polished his rifle, and noted the wind direction in his logbook. Every raindrop on a leaf sounded like a footstep. Every shadow could be a spy. At night, he would lie under a canopy of wet leaves, listening to the sea in the distance. It's their ships, he'd think, patrolling the coast. When planes passed overhead, he whispered a prayer to remain unseen. Sometimes he fired a single shot into the air, a signal meant for comrades who no longer existed. The irony was cruel: the more peaceful the world became, the more isolated Onoda grew. Tourists now flew over Lubang, snapping photographs from airplanes. Cargo ships passed with lights blazing. Radios played songs in English and Japanese. But for him, it was all enemy noise, propaganda designed to lure him out. He began to believe the entire island was a trap. The locals who farmed the valleys were enemy collaborators. The airplanes were reconnaissance craft. Even the moonlight seemed suspicious, too bright, too deliberate. I felt, he would later write, that the emperor was testing me. That my endurance was the proof of Japan's will. Sometimes, he spoke aloud to himself. He'd stand beneath the trees and address the darkness as if giving a report: Lieutenant Onoda, Imperial Army, still in combat. Area secure. Awaiting further orders. The forest gave no answer, except the rustle of rain and cicadas. Thousands of miles away, Japan was changing faster than any nation in history. Neon lights burned where ruins had once stood. Bullet trains cut through cities. The old empire had become an industrial miracle. Yet the name Onoda reappeared in its newspapers, a reminder of a time most wanted buried. In Tokyo, former soldiers debated his fate in bars. Some called him a hero of devotion. Others said he was a madman. One man murmured, "He is the mirror we avoid looking into." Meanwhile, on Lubang, Onoda endured another monsoon season. He repaired his uniform with scraps of canvas, kept his last grenades dry in a tin box. He trapped wild pigs, stored coconuts in a hollow tree, and still polished his sword every few days, just as his training had taught him. When loneliness became unbearable, he spoke to Kozuka's grave. "You did your duty," he'd say softly. "Now I must do mine." He no longer counted the years. The seasons flowed together: rains, dry winds, new rains. The jungle had become both his prison and his sanctuary. Once, in 1973, he found a small transistor radio washed ashore. He repaired it carefully, using wire from a flashlight. For weeks, he listened at night, the tiny speaker hissing with static. Voices in Japanese reached him across the air: songs, weather reports, laughter. He heard the word emperor once and froze, straining to catch more. Then the signal faded. It was like hearing ghosts, he later said. That brief taste of the modern world confused him even more. The Japan he heard sounded too alive, too bright, too happy to be real. It must be the Americans imitating our broadcasts, he told himself. A trick to break my resolve. So he smashed the radio against a rock and returned to silence. By now, even his reflection had become unrecognizable: gray hair, hollow cheeks, eyes that had forgotten what cities looked like. But inside, he still felt 22. The soldier who had landed in 1944 was still there, frozen beneath layers of years and vines. He believed the emperor still watched him, still depended on him. He was the last outpost of a vanished empire, a relic that refused to surrender. And somewhere beyond the waves, a new Japan was laughing, building, moving forward, unaware that one of its sons still stood guard in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting for an order that would never come. But 2 years later, a stranger would arrive, young, curious, fearless, searching not for glory, but for a ghost. He would come carrying a camera, not a rifle. And his name would change the course of Onoda's endless war. The morning mist over Lubang Island hung like smoke after a battle. The air was thick with salt and memory. A small wooden boat cut through the shallows, its lone passenger clutching a worn backpack and a camera. His name was Norio Suzuki, 24 years old, a wanderer, a dreamer, and, perhaps, the unlikeliest rescuer in history. "I'm looking for 3 things," he had told friends in Tokyo before leaving. A panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. They'd laughed. But on February 20, 1974, as his boat touched sand, the joke no longer sounded funny. He stepped into the jungle with nothing but rice, a flashlight, and a phrase rehearsed again and again: "Lieutenant, I am Japanese. I have come from our homeland." The villagers had warned him, "The soldier is a ghost. He kills those who look for him." Suzuki only smiled. "Then I'll look kindly." For 4 days he wandered inland, sleeping under palms, leaving small gifts where the air felt watched: a tin of meat, a pack of cigarettes, a note written carefully in old kanji. "I am Japanese. I am your friend." On the 5th day, a branch cracked. Suzuki froze. From the foliage emerged a thin figure in a sun-bleached uniform, rifle steady. His face was sharp, his eyes unblinking. The bayonet gleamed faintly. "Lieutenant Onoda?" Suzuki whispered. The man said nothing, just studied him, the jeans, the camera, the hair too long for a soldier. "Who sent you?" he asked finally, in formal Japanese. "No one. I came to bring you home." "Home?" The word fell like a stone. "Which Japan?" Suzuki swallowed. "The one that rebuilt. The one that remembers you." Onoda's gaze flicked to the camera. "You carry a weapon without bullets." "It takes pictures," Suzuki said gently. "Proofs of truth." "There are no proofs," Onoda muttered. "Only orders." But he didn't shoot. He lowered the rifle slightly, not in trust, but in fatigue. They sat under a tree. Suzuki spoke first. He told him about a Japan filled with lights, trains that flew over rails, and children who no longer bowed to teachers. Onoda listened without expression. "And the emperor?" he asked. "He still reigns," said Suzuki. The soldier nodded. "Then the war cannot be over." When Suzuki showed him a newspaper clipping from 1974, Onoda studied it like an enemy code. "Printed by the Americans," he decided. "They have learned to fake our words." He folded it carefully and gave it back. "Burn this when you leave." As dusk settled, they shared rice from Suzuki's pack. Onoda ate slowly, reverently, as if performing a ceremony. "Why come here, boy?" he asked. "To meet a man who refused to forget." "Then remember this," Onoda said. "Loyalty is not a memory. It is a wound that never closes." Suzuki dared one more question. "If Japan truly wanted you home, what proof would convince you?" Onoda looked toward the darkening forest. "Only one thing. My commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. His voice reading the order. Until then, I remain on duty." The next morning, Onoda vanished as silently as he'd come, leaving behind the imprint of his body on the earth. Suzuki returned to Japan like a man carrying a secret from another century. The press mocked him at first, the jungle fool who saw a ghost. But Suzuki refused to stop. He went from office to office, asking for Major Taniguchi. Most said the same thing: "He's long retired. Forget him." Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, in a quiet Tokyo bookstore, Suzuki found him. An old man, stooped, shelving paperbacks. "Major Taniguchi." The man turned, startled by the name he hadn't heard in 30 years. "I met your lieutenant," Suzuki said. "He's alive." Taniguchi froze. "That's impossible. He waits for your order to surrender." The silence that followed was heavy, like a curtain falling. Then the major whispered, I gave him an order I never cancelled. That's my failure. The government moved quickly. Arrangements were made with the Philippine authorities, the press caught the scent. Cameras, diplomats, and soldiers crowded airports. In the center of it all, Taniguchi remained calm, polishing the insignia he hadn't worn since 1945. Before leaving, he handed Suzuki a single sheet of paper, the original order of surrender, rewritten in careful brushstrokes. "Read it aloud with me," he said. Suzuki's voice shook as he reached the final line. "All combat operations shall cease immediately." Outside, spring rain began to fall, soft, unending, like the jungle rain that still whispered on Lubang. Somewhere beneath that same sky, a man in rags was cleaning his rifle for the 1,000th time, unaware that his commander was already crossing the sea to end the war that had defined his entire life. The world had changed. But for Hiroo Onoda, it was still 1944. And soon, the voice he'd been waiting for would finally break 30 years of silence. The jungle was soaked in mist when the past finally caught up. By the river hung a white cloth, fluttering weakly in the damp air, the agreed signal. Nearby stood an old man in a neat gray suit, shoes caked with mud, hat pressed to his chest. His voice trembled slightly as he called out, "Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, this is Major Yoshimi Taniguchi of the Imperial Army." For a moment, nothing moved. Then the leaves parted, and a man stepped from the trees. His uniform was a patchwork of rags, his rifle gleaming as if cleaned that morning. The face was older but unchanged in purpose. He saluted sharply, as though 30 years had been an afternoon. Taniguchi nodded once, then unwrapped a sheet of paper sealed in oilcloth. His voice steadied as he read. "By order of headquarters, all combat operations are to cease immediately. The Empire has surrendered. All soldiers are to lay down their arms and return to their homes. This order supersedes all previous commands." The words hung in the wet air. Onoda stared at him for a long time, the sound of insects the only witness. Then, slowly, he released the breath he'd been holding for 3 decades. "Sir," he said, "I have carried out your orders until this day." He crouched and opened a bundle wrapped in waxed canvas, his Arisaka rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, grenades, a bayonet, and the sword of an imperial officer. He placed them on the ground one by one, each motion precise, ritualistic. When he stood again, his hands were empty for the first time since he was 22. A Filipino soldier stepped forward to take the rifle. For a moment, their eyes met. The younger man whispered, 30 years, and Onoda almost smiled. "Yes," he said quietly. 30 years of doing my duty." That afternoon, he was driven from the jungle in a jeep. Villagers watched from the roadside, crossing themselves, whispering prayers. To them, the man in the back seat was a ghost finally returning to the world of the living. In Manila, President Ferdinand Marcos received him personally. Onoda stood stiffly in his patched uniform while Marcos read a formal statement of pardon for acts committed without malice. Cameras flashed. The old soldier bowed deeply, first to the president, then to the crowd. His eyes flicked upward, to the sky, to the sun, and for a heartbeat, he looked lost. When journalists asked if he regretted anything, he answered slowly, "I regret only that I obeyed an order longer than the war itself." But a soldier without orders is not a soldier. They gave him new clothes, gray trousers, a crisp shirt, a tie. The fabric felt foreign on his skin. "Do you need another size?" someone asked. "I haven't had a size in 30 years, he replied. On the flight to Tokyo, he pressed his forehead to the window. The ocean stretched below, endless and calm. Somewhere beneath those waves lay his years, his comrades, his fear, his faith. He closed his eyes and, for the first time, slept without a weapon beside him. At Haneda Airport, thousands waited. Flags waved, children shouted, flashbulbs exploded. He stepped onto the tarmac blinking against the light, bowing again and again, unsure how to respond to a welcome he didn't understand. Japan looked nothing like the home he'd imagined through the trees. There were highways, glass towers, vending machines glowing in the night. The Tokyo he remembered existed only in memory. Reporters followed him everywhere. They called him the last soldier. Some hailed him as a hero, others as a tragic relic. Onoda listened politely, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the jungle, on the men who hadn't come back, on the sound of rain against leaves. He visited his parents' graves, then the imperial palace, bowing deeply from the gate. "I have returned, your majesty," he whispered. "The war is over." In time, he gave interviews, published a book, and tried to adjust. But Tokyo never truly became home. The crowds, the noise, the ceaseless lights, everything felt unreal. In the forest, he once said, "I fought for Japan. Here, I fight to remember what Japan was." A year later, he returned briefly to Lubang to honor the dead. The villagers met him with cautious respect. An old farmer placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "No more ghosts." Onoda bowed. "No more," he replied. He spent the rest of his life quietly, planting trees, teaching survival skills, living away from the noise. When asked what 30 years in the jungle had taught him, he said, "Obedience is easy. Understanding is hard. A man must learn when an order has already expired." His sword rests today in a museum, its edge dulled by time. The rifle he once carried lies beside it, untouched, its metal cold and silent. And perhaps that is how his war truly ended, not with surrender, but with silence deep enough to hold both faith and doubt. The jungle grew back. The rain returned. And Hiroo Onoda finally belonged to the world again.